I grew up in a white two-story house on Maple Street in Cleveland, America. The house had peeling shutters the color of faded navy and a porch swing that creaked whenever the wind moved it. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary, but to me it was the whole center of the world. The kitchen smelled of coffee every morning, and the wooden floors groaned like they were alive. My name is Lena, and if there's one thing I learned early in that house, it's that walls can keep secrets just as much as they keep people safe. When my father died, the silence inside our home grew heavier than I could have imagined. It pressed down on everything, even on the light that tried to slip in through the curtains. My mother, Ruth, carried herself like a woman who had to become steel overnight, but that steel was brittle. I was still a teenager, but in that silence, I matured quickly. I learned to take responsibility, to guard what was mine, and to keep my life tightly organized, because if I didn't, the chaos of grief would have drowned me. Money became my anchor. Every dollar I earned and every dollar I saved gave me a sense of control. I started working before I even graduated high school, cafes, retail stores, anything that paid. Later, when I was old enough, I took jobs with longer hours, waitressing late into the night, bookkeeping during the day, and even cleaning offices on weekends. I didn't complain because I had a plan in place. By the time I turned 30, I had saved $920,000. I sometimes counted it in my head before falling asleep, like some people count sheep. That number wasn't just money. It was years of saying no to temptations, years of small meals, years of skipped vacations, and years of quietly putting myself first, even when it didn't look like it. Friends used to laugh at me. They'd say, "Lena, come to New York for the weekend." Or, "Let's go to Chicago and see a play." I always smiled and shook my head. "Not this time," I'd say. But what I didn't tell them was that every ticket I didn't buy, every night out I skipped, was another brick laid in the future I was building for myself. I kept the money in a high-yield account, divided between savings and short-term treasury bills. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. I imagined one day buying my own home, a place with big windows for the light, a small studio where I could paint, and maybe even a little garden where I could grow herbs. That dream kept me moving forward. There was one person outside my family who knew about my discipline and my savings. Frank Doyle, my grandfather's closest friend. Frank had been a police officer for decades, the kind of man who still walked like he was on patrol, eyes sharp, hands steady. He and Grandpa had been inseparable back in the day, telling stories about rivers, trains, and how they once wanted to see Europe but never made the trip. When Grandpa passed away, Frank kept checking in on me. He'd stop by, lean against the porch rail, and say things like, "Your grandpa trusted your good sense, Lena. So, do I." His words carried weight because Frank wasn't the kind of man who praised lightly. By then, I thought my mother and I had found some fragile balance. She worked, I worked, and we shared the same house, though it never quite felt like the home it once had been. Then, one evening in early spring, everything shifted. My mother came into the living room with a smile that didn't belong to her, a smile too bright, too hurried. She said she had met someone. His name was Victor. I'll never forget the first time I saw him. He drove up in a dark sedan, shiny and too polished for the quiet street we lived on. He stepped out wearing a sharp suit, and he carried with him the faint smell of cologne, strong, metallic, almost cold. He extended his hand to me, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that looked right through me, like he was measuring me, not meeting me. My stomach tightened. Something about him felt off, but I told myself not to judge too quickly. People deserve chances, don't they? People deserve new beginnings. That night, over dinner, Mom laughed at his jokes like she hadn't laughed in years. She leaned toward him in a way I had never seen her lean toward anyone before. I sat across the table, watching, and part of me wanted to be happy for her. Maybe she had found someone who could ease the weight she carried. Maybe, after all the years of widowhood, she deserved to smile again. But another part of me, the careful, cautious part, whispered warnings. As the weeks went by, Victor started coming around more often. He carried himself with confidence, but it was the kind of confidence that takes up too much space. He'd ask questions about my job, my savings, my plans for the future, questions that felt just a little too sharp. When I gave vague answers, he'd smile like he already knew more than I'd told him. I wanted to tell my mother my concerns, but every time I tried, she brushed me off. "Lena," she said, "you worry too much. He's good for me. You'll see." She wanted to believe in him, and I didn't want to be the reason her fragile happiness cracked. Still, I kept my eyes open. I noticed how quickly she changed when Victor was around. She wore new clothes, styled her hair differently, and even began talking about leaving Maple Street behind. "This house is old," she told me one night. "We deserve better. A new house, a fresh start." Her words cut deeper than she realized. Maple Street was flawed, yes, but it was mine. It was my father's laughter in the kitchen, my grandfather's stories on the porch, my own long nights spent planning my future. A new house might have been her dream, but it wasn't mine. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't know, was how quickly everything was about to unravel. Looking back, I can see the warning signs clearly. The way Victor's eyes lingered on my laptop when I balanced my accounts, the way Mom's questions about money became more frequent, the way they whispered in the kitchen when they thought I wasn't listening. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself people deserve second chances, even if they smell like cold metal and smile like predators. I told myself family ties mean something, and that my mother wouldn't cross the one line I thought she respected, my independence. But the truth was waiting, just around the corner, and soon it would come crashing into my carefully built life, like a storm that tears the roof off a house in the middle of the night. It happened faster than I ever imagined. Just 1 week after she first introduced Victor, my mother came home with a ring on her finger and a grin stretched wide across her face. She called him husband, like the word itself was a trophy she had been waiting all her life to hold. I stood in the hallway of our Maple Street house, clutching a laundry basket when she announced it. My heart sank to the floor. There had been no engagement, no waiting period, no quiet reflection. Just a hasty decision tied with a shiny band of gold. Victor walked in behind her, carrying himself like he already owned the place. His suit was pressed, his hair slicked back, his cologne hanging heavy in the air. He put an arm around her shoulder as if to claim both her and the house in one gesture. Then, like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, he slid a glossy flyer from inside his jacket and slapped it down on the coffee table. A new house, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a yard with potential. The listing price was written in thick black ink, $910,000, not including fees. My chest tightened. It wasn't just the number. It was the speed, the way my mother's eyes gleamed like a child's at Christmas, the way Victor nodded with a smirk, as if everything was already settled. "Isn't it beautiful, Lena?" Mom asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "We'll finally have something new, something we deserve. A real fresh start." I didn't answer. My hands trembled as I set the laundry basket down and excused myself to my room. I needed air. I needed space. Mostly, I needed to check. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and waited for the screen to load. For years, that balance had been my quiet comfort. It had been my proof that discipline paid off, that every sacrifice was worth it. But when the numbers finally appeared, my breath froze in my throat. Zero, well, not quite zero, but close enough. The savings account that once held $920,000 was empty, cleaned out with surgical precision over the past 48 hours. Multiple transfers, cashier's checks, the kind of transactions that looked deliberate, practiced. My vision blurred. My mother hadn't just borrowed from me. She had taken everything. I stumbled back into the living room, clutching my phone as if it were evidence. Mom and Victor were on the couch now, laughing softly, sipping wine. They looked up at me as though I were intruding in my own home. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "What did you do?" She set her glass down carefully, like I had interrupted something delicate. Then she looked at me with that expression she always wore when I disappointed her, like I had spilled juice on her freshly cleaned floor. "You're my daughter," she said evenly, her chin tilted high. "You need to pay me." The words landed like a slap. "Pay you?" I repeated. "For what?" For marrying a man you barely know? For stealing my life savings? Her eyes narrowed. Don't be dramatic, Lena. You're young. You'll earn more. I raised you. I fed you. You wouldn't have had the chance to save that money if it weren't for me. This is for the family. Our family. Victor chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. Family helps family, he said smoothly, as if he were reading from a script. That's how it works. But my heart hardened. I felt something inside me snap, not just because of the money, but because of the betrayal laced into every word. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even warned me. She had simply taken what wasn't hers and justified it with the word daughter. I shook my head slowly. No. And more than no, listen to me, both of you. You don't know what you did. Victor leaned back, smirking. Don't make this into a scene, he said. You'll thank us later when you see the house. But I knew there would be no thanks. There would be no forgiveness, not for this. That night, after they had gone to bed, I packed my things. Not much, just clothes, my sketchbooks, my passport, and the blue ceramic mug with the chip on the rim, the one small piece of home I couldn't leave behind. I moved quietly, careful not to wake them. My mother's laughter from earlier still echoed in my ears, sharp and strange. I loaded everything into the back seat of my old sedan and drove away. The house on Maple Street grew smaller in the rearview mirror, its windows dark, its porch swing creaking in the night wind. I didn't look back again. I drove until I found a motel off the highway, the kind with a flickering neon sign that hummed in the dark. The carpet smelled of cigarettes, the curtains didn't quite close, and the bedspread was patterned with shapes meant to distract from stains. But it was a place to breathe, a place that wasn't theirs. I set my bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the digital clock on the nightstand. 1:03 a.m. The red numbers glowed like a warning. I lay down, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept spinning, replaying the moment my mother said, "You're my daughter. You need to pay me." I thought about every sacrifice I had made to save that money, every late shift, every small meal, every trip I never took. I thought about the way my father's face used to light up when I showed him a good grade, and how proud Grandpa was when Frank Doyle told him I had a good head for responsibility. Would they have believed this? That Ruth, my mother, would take what wasn't hers and hand it to a man who smiled like a thief? But underneath the anger and the grief, there was something else, an understanding that chilled me deeper than the loss itself. I knew the truth that my mother didn't. That money wasn't fully mine. I had been keeping it safe for Frank Doyle, Grandpa's old friend, until he finished arranging legal paperwork for a fund. I had promised him it was secure. And now it was gone. I sat there in that dim motel room, listening to the hum of the neon outside, and realized the storm hadn't even hit yet. Tonight was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the real shock, and when it came, none of us would be ready. I promised you there would be a shock, and here it is. The $920,000 my mother drained from my account was not, in truth, mine to spend. It was money I had been entrusted to safeguard. I had carried that responsibility quietly, without telling anyone except the man who had asked me to hold it, Frank Doyle, my grandfather's oldest friend and a retired police officer. Months earlier, Frank had explained his plan. 2 retired officers he knew had been swindled by a crooked contractor in a property deal. They needed a legal fund, and Frank was helping coordinate it. But while the paperwork was being prepared, he didn't want the money resting in his own account. "Too many eyes on me," he'd said with a half-smile. Lena, you're steady. You keep receipts. I trust you." I had agreed, and we had both signed a simple written agreement. I tucked that paper into a folder I labeled Doyle, and I promised myself I would guard the money as fiercely as if it were my own. When I saw the empty account that night in the motel, my world tilted on its axis. The betrayal from my mother was already unbearable, but now the weight doubled. This wasn't just my future she had stolen. It was the trust of a man who had stood by my family when no one else did. At dawn, I called Frank. My voice was steady, but only because I forced it to be. My hands shook so badly, I had to press the phone in my ear with both of them. "Frank," I said, "it's gone. The account is empty. Mom and Victor took it. They're talking about a new house. There was a pause on the line. For a moment, I imagined the old man closing his eyes, taking in the blow. Then his voice came, low and calm. "Stay where you are, Lena. Don't confront them again. I'll meet you soon." By noon, we were sitting in a plain room at the precinct. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin stripes of gray daylight. Frank sat across from me, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a way I had never seen before. Between us on the table lay the folder with our agreement, the bank statements I had printed, and even a photograph of the glossy flyer my mother had waved in my face the night before. A detective named Maria Alvarez joined us. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that held both patience and sharpness. She introduced herself, shook my hand firmly, and sat down with a yellow legal pad. She asked questions in short, careful sentences, dates, amounts, names. She didn't let emotion color her tone, and yet there was something steadying about her presence, like she was anchoring the room. She wrote in a square, methodical hand, the kind of handwriting that refuses to lose track of the truth, even when the story twists. I answered every question as best I could, sliding papers toward her, explaining the timeline. When she asked if my mother knew the funds weren't mine, I hesitated. I don't know if she realized, I admitted. But she knew it was my savings. She knew it wasn't hers. Frank's face was unreadable, but his hands clenched and unclenched on the table. When we left the room, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Lena. You should never have had to carry this alone." I wanted to tell him I was sorry too, for trusting my mother with the space around my life, even when I didn't trust her with the keys to it. But the words stuck in my throat. Later that afternoon, we drove out toward Lakewood, a suburb not far from Cleveland. Detective Alvarez and 2 officers followed in their squad cars. I sat in the passenger seat of Frank's truck, my heart pounding. The streets grew neater as we approached the new development, rows of freshly painted houses with wide windows and manicured lawns. Then I saw it, a 2-story home with beige siding, a red front door, and a sold sign planted proudly in the grass. On the porch, my mother and Victor stood holding hands like teenagers. She wore a bright blouse I had never seen before, her hair styled in soft curls. Victor looked smug, his arm around her shoulders, his stance wide and claiming. The squad cars rolled to a stop, their blue lights spinning silently. My stomach dropped as Detective Alvarez stepped out, her badge clipped to her belt, her voice calm but authoritative. She approached them and began to ask questions, requests for invoices, proof of funds, documentation for the purchase. Victor let out a laugh, sharp and false. "We're just buying a house. Nothing illegal about that." My mother crossed her arms, her face tight, her eyes darting between me and the officers. The questions became commands. The officers produced copies of the cashier's checks used for the down payment. They bore my name, my account, and then came the letter, a typed statement claiming I had gifted the money to my mother. At first glance, the signature looked like mine, but the longer I stared, the more the differences shouted. The loops were too wide, the slant too sharp. A forgery, but one done with care. Detective Alvarez's tone shifted. She read my mother her rights in that same clear, steady voice. My mother froze, her face pale, her hand trembling as she reached for Victor. He reacted first. He spat out a curse, loud and ugly, and tried to step between her and the officer. His hand twitched toward his pocket, but another officer caught his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. The scene unfolded in seconds, quick and efficient, like a door being slammed shut by the wind. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my heart hammering in my chest. Frank stayed a step behind me, his hands in the pockets of his long coat. He could have stepped forward, could have taken charge, but he didn't. He let the process play out, his eyes tired, his jaw hard. When the squad cars finally pulled away, carrying my mother and Victor inside, the neighborhood was silent except for the hum of the wind through the new construction. The red door of the house swung slightly, left ajar in their haste. Frank looked at me then, his voice low. "This is why we have rules, Lena. To protect what matters." I swallowed hard, fighting back the sting of tears. The house on Maple Street had never felt so far away. And though justice had begun to move, the hollow ache inside me whispered that nothing would ever be the same again. The legal process stretched into weeks that felt like whole seasons. Days blurred into one another, filled with court dates, paperwork, and long phone calls I never wanted to make. I stayed with my friend Emily during that time, in her narrow two-story house near the Cuyahoga River. It wasn't grand, but it was warm, and that warmth saved me. Every morning, she made tea and left it by my bed, sometimes with a note in her neat handwriting. "You're stronger than you think." Those small gestures mattered more than I can say. The court moved quickly to freeze the sale of the new house. The funds my mother and Victor had tried to use were traced back through cashier's checks and digital transfers. The evidence was undeniable, and the charges piled up. Forgery, theft, fraud. It was almost mechanical the way the system moved, like gears grinding forward, no matter who got caught between the teeth. I sat in courtrooms with pale walls and hard benches, watching lawyers argue in voices that carried no emotion, as if this were all just paperwork to them. But for me, it was everything. It was my life, my savings, my trust, shattered and dragged into the open. The bank returned what it could, but not all. Some money was gone for good. Fees, penalties, gaps I didn't fully understand. Life rarely balances like a clean ledger. I learned that the hard way. The prosecutor spoke to me on the phone one afternoon, her voice brisk, professional. She used the words restitution and forgery as if they were just part of her day's vocabulary. But when I hung up, I sat at Emily's kitchen table and cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. It wasn't just grief, it was release. The sound came out raw, like a door opening that had been jammed shut for too long. Eventually, I began to think about rebuilding. I didn't want to return to Maple Street. That house had become something else now, more like a picture in a museum than a place to live. You can look at it, remember it, but you cannot touch it, cannot return to what it was. So I started searching for something new. I found it on the west side of Cleveland, a small brick house listed for $265,000. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. Just a sturdy place with a patch of grass in the front, a living room that caught afternoon light, and a small room I knew instantly would become my studio. I paid for it with dollars I could prove were truly mine, and when the keys were handed to me, I felt a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying finally slide off my shoulders. The first thing I did was paint the front door green. A deep, strong green that felt like growth, like life returning. I built shelves for my sketchbooks along the studio wall, lining them neatly like old friends waiting to be opened again. For weeks, I filled the quiet rooms with the sounds of hammering, painting, arranging. Slowly, the house became a reflection of me, not of betrayal, not of loss, but of survival. One weekend, I took the train to Chicago. I needed to step outside my own story, to breathe in another city's air. I wandered through an art show, losing myself in the colors and lines of other people's visions. At a small bookstall, I bought a collection by a British painter for £30. In one of the essays, he wrote that every honest line drawn is a kind of prayer. I'm not very religious, but those words stuck with me. Honesty is prayer. That sounded like something I could live by. When I look out over Lake Erie now, I sometimes still think of Europe. I think of the trains that cross borders without stopping, of maps spread wide with oceans between continents. My grandfather and Frank always dreamed of going, and maybe one day I will too. But this story is rooted here, in America, in the soil beneath my feet, in the neighborhoods where I have learned both the weight of betrayal and the strength of resilience. Sometimes, when I drive through Cleveland, I pass by Maple Street. The old house still stands, its shutters peeling a little more each year. The porch swing is still there, creaking when the wind moves it, singing the same old song it did when I was a child. I never go up the steps. I never cross the threshold. I just stand on the sidewalk and whisper a quiet goodbye to the girl who once lived there. The girl who kept every receipt, every record, believing that if she stayed careful enough, life would not break her. I know now that life breaks everyone sooner or later. The real question is what you choose to keep afterward. Here is what I keep now. I keep the truth that money is not love. It is not safe, but it has a way of revealing love, of showing you who will stand by you when it goes missing. I keep the memory of Detective Alvarez's steady hand on her notepad, the way she listened without judgment, the way her calm presence reminded me that truth has weight even when it feels invisible. I keep the image of Frank's tired eyes, carrying both sorrow and strength, the eyes of a man who had seen more disappointment in people than he ever wanted to, yet still chose to trust me. I keep the kindness of Emily's home, the tea on the nightstand, the extra blanket folded at the end of her couch, the silence she offered without demanding words from me. And most of all, I keep my own voice. The voice that said, "No, you don't know what you did," even when it shook, even when the room went quiet and I stood alone. That voice carried me through. Now, in my new house, I carry a single key on a plain metal ring. No ribbon, no charm, no decoration, just the cut of the steel, simple and sharp, shining like a small moon. Every time I turn it in the lock, I am reminded that this door opens for me, and me alone. That is enough. For now. For today, and in that small act, turning the key, opening the door, I know I am home.